and I'll be able to tell you.
All right, so.
Wait 1 second. Okay, you're good.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're also welcoming now our speaker, Galia. So Galia, we're just starting. So our event today is part of the series, lecture series in the architecture department of the School of Architecture and Design in New York Institute of Technology. And our event is called Collective Automation. Our event is organized by Pablo Lorenzo Eiroa, who's been actually planning this event for a while, but we managed to do this year. And so we enhanced it. We added more speakers. Pablo is associate professor and director of the AI Research Lab here in New York Tech. Sandra Manninger, who is an associate professor here, also in computational design, and myself, I'm an assistant professor here and chair of the lecture and event committee. And our esteemed speakers for today, and I'm going to present them in the way they're going to present. So we're going to have a series of speakers and have a discussion in the end, and we're going to have a 20-minute presentation from each. So if you have questions, you can keep them for the end when we're going to have the moderated discussion. So our first speaker is Theodora Barduli, who's an assistant professor at Peter Hofu School of Architecture at McGill University. We're going to present her right before her talk. Our second speaker, Alexandros Tsamis, who's the director and professor at the Build Ecologies program at CASE at RPI here in Brooklyn. And our next speaker will be Galia Solomonov, who's professor at Columbia, a director of Housing Lab. And last but not least, Daniel Cardoso, who's associate professor in the computation in the School of Architecture at CMU. So our lecture series in general brings together diverse topics that address technologies, issues of community and crisis. So we had this broader theme of design dialogues for our lecture series. But I'd like to invite Pablo, who initiated the event, to talk a little bit more about the topic of collective automation.
Thank you, Atina. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of Dean Maria Pervelina, I would like to welcome you today to our lecture, Automation in Design, that is particularly focused on the issue of collectives. One of the issues we have been discussing for a while is if there are any critical means to address automation and artificial intelligence, both in relationship to algorithms, but also in relationship to fabrication. The architecture has often been related with construction, development, and growth. Architecture's most ecological versions have often been identified with recycled materials, net zero, positive energy production, but mostly about adding to the built environment. Urbanism's most ecological version could be identified with a circular economy and reactivating ecological processes. But these options seem to offer limited ranges of possibilities that are not correlational with the set of crises we are facing, not even the horizon of what is anticipatory possible. How can automation, innovation, decentralization, and community emancipation, and real democratic scientific representation could be understood in relationship to current technologies such as blockchain, automation, simulation, and robotic construction, or even deconstruction? The event is designed to discuss radical, innovative relationship between architecture and the environment, with a particularity of addressing if there are any possibilities left in the time frame that we are living at in relationship to how we address developmentalism in architecture, or how we can radically redefine architecture from that point of view. Next, we're going to start introducing the first guest speaker, and after we continue with the discussion after all the presentations. Thank you very much for your participation.
Yes, and thank you, Pablo. So you'll hear from our speakers like various topics on computation and sustainable materials and so on, and the aspects that Pablo addressed. So let me start with introducing Theodora. So Theodora will talk about algorithmic automation before big data. And so Theodora, as I mentioned, is an assistant professor at architecture at McGill University. Her historical work on algorithmic reconfigurations of architecture has been published in several peer-reviewed journals and edited collection. She's the author of the forthcoming book, Graph Vision, Digital Architecture Skeletons, which we can't wait to read. Co-author and co-editor of Designing the Computational Image, Image and Computational Design with Daniel Cardoso, who is also here with us. And Theodora has also co-curated with Daniel the exhibition Vers un imaginaire numérique in Montreal in 2021, and her scholarship has been recognized with the 2022 Best Paper Award by Acadia and the 2022 Mahoney Prize by CICSIS for an article co-authored with David Theodore. And she's an external examiner for 2 graduate programs at the Barton School of Architecture, UCL, and the communications editor for that journal. So thank you, Theodora. We'll leave the floor to you, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Athena. I'm just going to share my screen for a second. And just really a big thank you to you and to Pablo and to Sandra for organizing and for the invitation today. It's really a huge pleasure to be part of this event and to speak alongside wonderful colleagues who do very timely and important work on the entanglements of architecture and automation. I also want to thank you for offering this very exciting prompt on collective automation that Pablo already spoke about. So automation, as it traverses continua of material and cognitive labor, is of course an expansive and nebulous concept that can hold a multitude of sites, tools, and processes, some of which we will talk about today. And now the prompt collective automation is particularly rich as it, on the one hand, evokes a long-standing history of thinking about automation of work or of design work in particular as enabling new collectivities, new forms of collective life, new forms of social life, much like the symposium invites us to do in many ways. But the symposium prompt can also be read as acknowledging the irreducibly collective character of automation. Automation as a collective endeavor is a particularly timely discussion as it promises to retrieve modes of political agency in the midst of the so-called generative AI revolution. For instance, in an article that just came out in the New Yorker just a few days ago, technologist and futurist Jaron Lanier invites us to think of large language models and text-to-image tools not as creating an individual intelligence, an AI, but really mashing up work done by humans in ways that are agile and unpredictable as innovative forms of social collaboration. So my contribution to our field's renewed confrontation with algorithmic automation comes from a historical standpoint. I look back at a long-standing negotiation of architectural agency with algorithmic systems and logics, which dates back to architects and designers' basal engagements with digital electronic computers and computation in the 1960s. For almost 6 decades, computer algorithms have been persistently marshaled to automate not only rote architectural tasks and clerical work, but also those exalted undertakings of configuring space and articulating form, which are overseen as the core of creative architectural design. So today we'll talk about engagements between architectural design, data, and algorithms in the specific context of early 1960s UK. And these engagements were quite transformative because they gave rise to the idea that computers could actually design architecture and are part of the history of the construction of this idea of an automated architect, of architecture as an algorithmically automatable process. Before diving into the story, which uses material from my forthcoming book that Athena also mentioned, Graph Vision, I wanted to offer some introductory kind of remarks on key concepts that motivate this historical work and which might also be relevant for our collective conversation after. So when we talk about algorithms, we always talk about some form of automation. Data anthropologist Ian Lowry reminds us that all algorithms automate. Algorithms automate by abstracting tasks and processes and ordering them into stepwise recipes that are amenable to systematic mathematical calculation. And in turn, historically, specific renditions of automation as a technical and political project have propelled algorithmic abstraction in architecture and in other fields. Such abstraction relies on processes of keeping and of discarding, of selecting information that is deemed relevant for a given task in a specific context. Cora Klumbite and Lauren Britton, in their article Abstracting Otherwise, point out that algorithmic abstraction is in fact extraction that stems from, but also acts to transform a concrete thing or setting. Algorithms' entanglements with concrete settings are, however, faced through the production of universalisms that often negate contextual specificities. Such suppression of context also erases intricacies that could subvert the definition of the very problem that algorithms purport to solve, and as many scholars have argued, render algorithmic abstraction as a politically oppressive technique, one that upholds white supremacist and culturally imperialist notions of universality. Considering algorithms' relationships to the data they parse and what Yannis Loukissas has referred to as their local nature is a pathway for countering troublesome universalities and placing algorithms in concrete settings of development and use. One way to do that is to look at the precarious translations between data and mathematical abstractions so as to position architectural algorithms not as hermetic and autonomous techniques, but instead, as Matteo Paschinelli would put it, as emergent forms that stem from very specific material, social, and cultural realities. These ideas buttress the need to place algorithms in specific settings of data extraction and collection, which are very often spatial and architectural contexts. So with this, I will segue into my main story for today, which launches from large-scale building research endeavors in the post-war UK, which made massive amounts of observational data available and fostered desires for that data's manipulation. After the Second World War, the UK saw a rapid growth in public building with domestic healthcare, educational, or governmental uses. Alongside this focus and a concern with efficiently using public money, came the founding of various research agencies that focused on large-scale fact-finding inquiries. Government-funded charitable organizations such as the Building Research Station and the Nuffield Trust collected information and established standards about the production of buildings and the needs of their inhabitants. Part of these initiatives were massive observational studies. For instance, this is a diagram taken from a 1963 paper in the Architects Journal, which shows the average human circulation among various hospital departments from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. during 1 week. The diagram is based on a study that was carried out by the Building Research Station between 1961 and 1962 in 2 large acute general hospitals of 600 to 700 beds, which was then expanded to 9 acute general hospitals in England and Wales, where data was recorded for more than 54,000 trips, journeys that hospital staff were taking. Building scientists and architectural researchers appealed for the use of these large amounts of observational data that came out from similar studies, not only for evaluating the efficiency of existing buildings, but for generating new and better ones. In this impossible but expedient translation from data that are collected on existing buildings to new buildings, digital electronic computers, which at the time sparsely appeared in universities, such as the Atlas Computer in Manchester, for instance, or computer research centers, such as the Ferranti Research Center in London, for hope and possibility. Without interactive or graphic capabilities yet and occupying entire rooms, computers were still perceived as elaborate calculators, able to not only take away the tedium of rote and repetitive tasks, but also, to quote a 1962 article in the Architecture Journal titled Computers in Building, to handle and process calculations of bewildering complexity at a speed far in excess of that of the human brain. At the time the article I just quoted from was written, the main applications of computers to building were managerial in focus. Two applications, for instance, that are worthwhile mentioning are the Program Evaluation Research Technique, or PERT, and the Critical Path Method, or CMP. These methods used computers to tackle the scheduling of construction operations. Logistical in focus, these methods established the computers as, quote, again from the Architecture Journal, the executive's tool par excellence. Computer designed buildings, again, quoting from that same article that was surveying the use of computers in building in the early 1960s, were still very much in the realms of science fiction, because it was not clear yet how to formulate the work and decisions of architects on a mathematical basis that would make them amenable to computer analysis. Yet just 1 year later, in May 1963, the Architecture Journal was announcing an experiment in which a computer had been put to work to design a hospital, rendering what was claimed as fiction a few months before as a real yet financially precarious possibility. Seeing computers in action in architecture seemed to have, as the eponymous news clipping suggested, three possible results: complete failure, complete success, or some indeterminate mixture of the two. The experiment to use computers to plan a hospital was undertaken under the auspices of the Ministry of Health Chief Architect Tatton Brown and directed at architects and other ministry officers. Bruce Archer, who would subsequently become a major leading figure in the institutionalization and dissemination of systematic design methods, spearheaded this experimental demonstration in collaboration with Ferranti, which was one of the UK's leading electrical equipment companies. Ferranti had also established a computing center in London at the time, and this experiment was conducted as part of Ferranti's service to architects, to the architectural profession. The idea was that in planning a hospital, architects were confronted with copious amounts of information in the form of room schedules, based on which they developed a hospital plan. Its configuration of rooms and of activities came with different efficiencies, and it was impossible to tell if the architect had picked the best plan among the myriads of possibilities, of which an architect could only evaluate a handful. For only 16 activities, for instance, this article that I'm extracting the image from, again called Computers in Building, that was talking about the Archer-Ferranti experiment, calculated, so for 16 activities, there were more than 1 trillion possibilities that required trial and evaluation. This, as the Architecture Journal article that was presenting the experience, the experiment stated, casually invoking an all-familiar troublesome metaphor, was, quote, the dupe at which that fast-working slave, the computer, is best used, end quote. And Daniel has, of course, spoken quite a bit about these metaphors and their problems. But using computers required two fundamental steps: translating data about design, about hospital life into numbers, and finding the right mathematical model, devising a mathematical conception for the data. The approach that Archer proposed was the adaptation of a computer programming technique known as the transportation technique, which was traditionally used for tankers, oil wells, and refineries, and had to do with plotting efficient routes for vehicles that were transporting goods between various points. Archer turned the transportation technique inside out and used it to optimize the locations of the points of origin instead of optimizing the movements between them. To achieve this, he proposed a topological model, as he called it, of the hospital that was based on the expected shape of the building, which he rendered as a three-dimensional square grid whose vertices corresponded to the number of activities that needed to be allocated in the hospital. The computer placed activities on the vertices and then calculated the total so-called cost of the configuration by multiplying the priority of each activity pair with their distance, which in this case was the number of edges that were intervening between the two activities. The optimal solution was the one with the lowest cost. The Archer and Ferranti demonstration had quite a bit of impact. It invited reactions and letters from various architects and building scientists, among which was also a letter to the editor from B. Whitehead, who was a lecturer in the Department of Building Science at the University of Liverpool. In a letter to the journal, Whitehead criticized Archer's method for being indifferent to the intricate interrelation between all the different activities that make up a hospital. This risked absurd and untrustworthy outputs, such as optimizing the outpatient department, the X-ray department, in relation to the operating theater only, and placing them at the opposite ends of the hospital despite their close functional interrelationship. In that letter, he announced a new approach to the issue of planning hospitals based on hospital data, and a computer program that was in the works that he and his students were developing at the University of Liverpool. A few months later, writing with a PhD student by the name of Mohammed Zakaria Ahmed Elders, Whitehead published a computer program in the Architects Journal written in ALGOL that could compute the location of 37 activities in 10 minutes on a KDF9 English electric computer. The algorithm was based on data representing hospital staff's movement in the operating theater, which were represented in the form of string diagrams. So string diagrams were physical thread and nail models that represented movement between activities that took place in distinct locations on the hospital floor plan. So the idea was that one would take a scale print of the hospital floor plan, place pins where discrete activities were taking place, and then with thread follow hospital staff around and really document how often a trip between two activities take place. So the thicker the line, the thicker the thread, the more frequently that specific trip was taken. And again, this was a method that was widely used in the Nuffield Provincial Hospitals Trust Job Analysis team since the late 1940s. For the computer algorithm to work, one had to manually prepare the data by hand plotting the string diagram information about trips between activities for each individual type of staff into a matrix called the association chart, which we see here, and weighing each trip according to the staff salary. So a surgeon's trip would be weighed much higher than a nurse's trip, for instance. Then this diagram was populated with information about each activity's dimensions, the actual floor area that it required, which was calculated as multiples of 10 feet by 10 feet modules or elements, units of floor area. Using this, Whitehead and Elders produced what they call the relationships matrix, which was a square grid of cells with each cell corresponding to one element. And each grid cell also had a unique store number in the computer memory. The algorithm assigned activities to grid cells based on the principle of keeping close to each other the activities connected with the largest number of trips. After positioning all activities, the computer printed out a list of element numbers with their respective positions in a grid. Reading this output, the architect would then assign the cells of a gridded page to specific hospital functions, and from that, draw a schematic floor plan that would then be elaborated with windows, walls, doors, and so on. Among the references that Whitehead and Elders cited in their paper were various methods for systematic planning of factories and production facilities that were developed by management scientists and industrial engineers in the UK and the United States. These references included Richard Muther's systematic layout planning method, which was a set of representational conventions and procedures for laying out equipment in existing factory predominantly, but also other buildings. Whitehead and Elders invoked factories, of course, rhetorically as a model for a well-planned, efficient hospital. Equating a hospital to a factory was a familiar metaphor, but they also used many of the conventions that were included in systematic layout planning methods in their algorithm. They automated some of these manual methods through their computer algorithm. Leafing through the systematic layout planning manual, for instance, one finds illustrations of the factory planner, who is portrayed, of course, as a white male engineer, drawing an activity relationships diagram to picture that looked like a string diagram to picture flows of materials and flows of people in the factory floor plan. And then overlaid transparent grid sheets on the factory floor plan to really think about this kind of overlay of activities on the actual geometry of the floor plan. The planner is then depicted moving around physical square pieces of cellulose or colored plastic on a grid fitted on a drawing of the factory floor plan to assign area to these activities. In Whitehead and Elders' work, the material square pieces moved around with one indices mapped onto the elemental units of the relationships matrix, which were assigned new positions not with one's fingers, but with electric signals. Whitehead and Elders' computer program automated some of these material manual practices of systematic layout planning, reminding us of John Egar's argument that the algorithmic imagination and systematization of certain practices is a precondition often for their computer automation. The logic of modularity ran across the distinct but mutually reinforcing material systems of the cellulose blocks and the computer memory indices, cultivating pernicious transpositions between buildings and software, which of course Daniel has also written about. But the computer automation of these manual practices also transformed and expanded them by laying over them a pristine mathematical abstraction. The mathematical abstraction that lay at the core of the Whitehead and Elders' ALCOL program was a graph, which we see here very clearly represented in a report by Philip Tabor at the Land Use Built Form Study Center in Cambridge, where really he's redrawing the string diagram by putting visual emphasis on the points, on these moments of these discrete locations, which are then tied together with relationships. The graph allowed one to directly move from empirical data to form seemingly without distortion. Recast as graphs, sets of points and dimensionless lines freed from the geometry of a specific floor plan, string diagrams were translated into matrices in a one-to-one way, and matrices could then be easily input into a computer, which would then relink the activity location points, the pairs, with a new set of relationships, creating a more efficient floor plan. Although crucial for the translation of the string diagram data and the algorithmic automation of the systematic layout process, the graph remained hidden in the Whitehead and Elders algorithm. This hiding also engendered dispute. In October 1964, Peter Levin, a researcher working in collaboration with the Building Research Board, published an article in the Architects Journal claiming that optimum layouts in buildings such as hospitals could be achieved, quote, without resorting at all to a computer and with the aid of only a paper and pencil, end quote. Levin used the data from Whitehead and Elders' paper, which was actually the only paper he cited in his response, and argued that it sufficed to draw the data as graphs and use simple rules from graph theory to derive an optimal layout. The designer would then have complete control over the process, Levin suggested, and the method would not require any equipment other than the tools that architects were already using. Whitehead and Elders, of course, rebutted. Graph simplicity, they wrote, in responding to Levin in a letter again to the editor, would likely attract the attention of architects, but this simplicity contained the seeds of danger. The complacent would assume they are already doing what graphs can do, and the more open-minded, and again I'm quoting here, would assume that graphs are already doing what computers can do. But automation, according to Whitehead and Elders, mattered. They wrote in a kind of scathing way, it is possible to wash clothes in a dolly tub, but it is faster and cheaper in the long run to use a washing machine. So I will close with an image from a different setting in what became a vast constellation of projects that launched from graph-based representations of activities and space, whose lineages trace back to the story I have been telling today. Here, we see the graph on the screen, a mediator between algorithmic automation and human decisions and agency. So today, as we navigate a world of black boxes and increasingly opaque and inscrutable algorithms, the question of showing and hiding that I've spoken about today becomes a crucial one. As the mathematical models that drive algorithmic automation lose their referential attributes, their propensities to represent realities of various kinds, and become measured instrumentally, the kinds of diagrammatic legibilities that graphs once had become elusive. The project then of grounding algorithms in concrete settings and their scalar expansions becomes all the more difficult but pressing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adora. This was a very, very insightful lecture. I'll keep my thoughts and comments for later, so we don't, run out of time. But so, Sandra, if you'd like to introduce our next speaker.
Sure. Thank you so much, also from my side, for this very inspiring talk. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Alexandros Tamis. He's an architect and assistant professor at the School of Architecture, RPI. He's a graduate program director of Built Ecologies in a master's and PhD program, and the associate director of CASE. He earned his PhD in architecture, design and computation, and Master of Science in Design and Building Technology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. With a working definition for the built environment as the effective distribution of material, energy, and information in space for socio-natural effects, Tamis' works are at the intersection of design and the architectural sciences. He focuses on next-generation composite materials, climate-adaptive energy systems, and advanced manufacturing technology as they relate to advances in computation. His research work has been published widely in peer-reviewed journals and conferences. He has 4 patents for innovation in materials, energy systems, and manufacturing processes. He's a member of the NYS Fibers and Grains Work Group. And here I would like to invite Alexandros to share his screen with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank Pablo, Athena, and you, Sandra, for the invitation. I would like to iterate what Theodora was saying, that it's very nice to meet with my colleagues and have the opportunity to discuss what we have been doing within the topic at hand. I wanted to take some time to talk to you a little bit about the context under which this presentation takes place. I'm the associate director of CASE. CASE has a unique characteristic. It is an institute-wide research center. That means that it doesn't belong to the School of Architecture, but it belongs to RPI as a whole. It has a mandate to develop research for the built environment by bridging between different departments and different disciplines. In a way, most of us are architects, so we have one foot strongly within the Department of Architecture, and we have the other foot everywhere else. We have one foot that is lazy and one foot that is very busy going around in different places. We also like to think that we do work that cuts across scales. What we say between us is that we work with a microscope, and at the same time we work with the satellite. One of the things I would like to point out is that I don't think that we are doing architecture in general. I think that we are doing design, so I'm not going to show you architecture work. And also, I'm going to show you work that is very recently under development still for the past 4 years at CASE. There are a couple of things that we look at when we develop any project, and one of them is we have these kinds of phrases that we use as a compass, as a conjecture that we often debate whether they stand true or not. And one of them comes from inside the discipline of architecture, and that's, for architecture, the socio-ecological concerns coupled with advances in computation, we think have already cast a new role in the notion of environment. Instead of being the passive, conceptualized, or historicized context of an architectural object, the environment is quite literally becoming the object of design itself. What we are trying to say here is that we need, in order to meet the challenges, the socio-ecological challenges that we have ahead of us, we need to shift our attention from the object to what is around an object and make what is around the object actually the object of design. What is always elusive is like, what is an environment? Typically, it's whatever surrounds, whatever is your object of study. So automatically, it is a never-ending babushka. But we often talk about it as an ecology. We talk about it as a system. We talk about it as a feedback loop. We talk about it as a supply chain. We talk about it as a microbiome. There are many terms we use for this. The point is that today's complexity and the ability we have to have access to data, to determine patterns, to forecast, to understand what's going to happen in the future based on what happened in the past, gives us the ability to address contexts as a whole. We are trying to replace, in essence, the word built environment, the phrase built environment, with the phrase built ecology. So what we are doing, our own discipline, if you will, the thing that is outside of any other discipline, is what is a built ecology. And built ecology for us is the result of the effective distribution of material, energy, and information in space and time for socio-natural effect. This is because we are trying to understand what are we actually manipulating when we are creating a built ecology, and we think that material, energy, and information are three basic ingredients of space and time that we can measure in grams and joules and bits, and therefore we can become efficient about them. We are also saying that this is towards an end, which is a socio-natural effect. We don't separate the artificial environment from the natural environment. We understand that these things have intricacies between them. And we know that any research project of socio-ecological, in a socio-ecological context is as much a matter of fact as it is a matter of fiction. Therefore, we need to be able to project a future and work backwards from it. I was planning to show you many things, but then I realized that 20 minutes is going to be too little time. So I'm going to focus this presentation on the work that we are doing on energy. The fact that the built environment or our building systems are responsible for the 40% of carbon emissions is a very well-known statistic that has been circulating around. So one of the things that we are trying to do is figure out how to reduce energy consumption in buildings, and also how to replace fossil fuels or finite resources with renewable resources. Rainer Banham, in the Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, gave us a way to think about how early societies started tampering with their environment, started tampering with how to shield themselves from the environment. And he basically says that there are two approaches. One of them is to take a pile of wood and build an envelope that shields you from that environment and therefore creates your own weather, an interior weather that is controlled. Or another one is to take the same pile of wood and burn it, and therefore tamper with the local meteorology. For himself as well, this is a dilemma that is not it's artificial, because why not do both? And in fact, what we have been doing is both. Today, when we think about heating and cooling, 95% of the time we think about a building envelope that is as insulated as possible. It can reject the environment as much as possible, and at the same time we keep optimizing systems that have replaced fire in order to bring energy in the interior. If we are to think about this as a biological analog, we call this paradigm the endothermic paradigm. The human body has the capacity to metabolize food, create energy, heat that then gets distributed in the body, and then with our skin and with our clothes, we kind of enclose the heat inside, or we can choose to release it. We are kind of working on something that we call climate adaptive energy systems. And that is a logic that is coming from another biological paradigm, that of the cold-blooded animals. The cold-blooded animals do not have the capacity to create heat when they eat. So they need a different way to thermoregulate, and they do that by choosing a way to relate to their environment. The frog buries itself under the mud, either when it's too cold outside or when it's too hot outside. It dives into the water, or it sits under the sun and enjoys the rays. So this is the ectothermic paradigm in terms of biology, in which, in essence, there is an opportunistic every time relationship between an object and its environment in order to be able to exchange heat. So we are trying to imagine a way with which we can create a vascular system that will allow heat to be manipulated, absorbed or released, exchanged between different spaces, exchanged between underground and above ground, absorb heat from the sun, and so on. We started by thinking about how can we maximize the amount of water we can hold on a surface. So we started developing some, as architects, we started developing some algorithms that would maximize the length of a tube that would hold water. In essence, if we were to maximize the volume of water, we thought that would be a way to maximize the energy efficiency of the system that we were imagining. We very soon realized that the energy efficiency would be a function of two things: the capacity to absorb or release heat, but also the work that needs to be done in moving that water around. So the too many bends and too many kinks make a pump work too much, which means that you do not actually save energy from doing this. So we ended up simplifying and creating what we call a hydrosip, which is an integrated a panel, a SIP panel, a structurally insulated panel that has a hydronic system on each side. In essence, imagine that you have a film of water on the outside and the inside of a wall, and you have the ability to circulate water between the different layers in order to release or contain heat. This is an object that is a physical hardware object, and it's also accompanied by a plethora of sensors, IoT kinds of things that manage both the input and the output of the system. Thinking about how this works, it basically has two modes of operation. It has the isolating mode, in which you operate the two layers independently of each other, in essence, increasing the insulation value of a building envelope. Or you work in heat exchange mode, in which you connect the two layers together in order to absorb from a cold area to a hot, and vice versa. This is a cyber physical system. So in this diagram, the only thing that is physical is the square with a frog. Everything else is a data point, a sensor, a thing that manages data either as input or as output. This is a diagram from Modelica. Modelica is a piece of software that is physics-based. They use it to model cars, and we have modeled every single element, physical element of the object, in order to create simulations to test the viability of it. The result of this, which is 5 years of work, is that a system like this, only installed in a roof, is more energy efficient than the most energy efficient heating and cooling system that we have today available in academia, anything between 5% and 50% efficiency. And that is without connecting to it any renewable energy source. That is simply by connecting a heat pump to a system like this. If you connect a geothermal loop, so if you allow the frog to bury itself underground, then these numbers jump to significantly higher ones. Of course, they come at the cost of a geothermal installation. We have rated its COP. The COP is the ratio of how much energy you put in versus how much energy you take, effective energy you take out. The most energy efficient system that exists today has a rated COP of 2.5. We have managed to achieve a COP of 4.5. We are trying to make this, as you can imagine, we are trying to do this as a real project to be implemented. So we are also thinking about it as a construction system, and we're thinking about the way it would become like a modular system that would be able to be deployed as a replacement of the traditional SIP technology. So we are focusing very much on understanding how a joint could allow you to slide in and out different panels and allow you to with minimal intervention, to create the plumbing necessary to achieve the results. We are looking at a construction sequence of sorts with prefabricated systems. So if you want to think about it in broader terms, we have a joint and we have a thermodynamic principle, and we are trying to understand how this would become a ubiquitous construction material or system, as a modular construction system that replaces the typical ones we have today. A second project that I wanted to show you is one that we recently started. So this is only a year old. It's called Community Demand Response. It is a project that looks at renewable energy integration at the scale of the city. And what we are trying to do here is understand how we can equitably address energy transition. The energy transition requires solar installations, all of these kinds of technologies that we all know. Nevertheless, any incentive that exists or any subsidy that exists and so on is only about homeowners or like large corporations and so on. Renters, people that don't have access to capital, cannot participate in this. And that is a loss both for the people that cannot afford it, and also for us as a whole, because the more people participate in the energy transition, the faster we're going to actually achieve it. So we have found that there is a thing called demand response, which is a service that electricity providers like Con Ed in New York, they give an incentive. They pay anybody that would be able to save them energy in time of crisis. Blackouts happen because the electricity Con Ed cannot provide enough electricity for the high heat event that will take place on Thursday between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the evening. And therefore, they have established what they call demand response, which is asking entities to cut down on their electricity whenever there is an event like this to be happening, whenever they predict it. And that happens in one of two ways. The first way is that they go to large factories, or they go to corporate offices, they go to skyscrapers and so on, and they ask them to shut down. Why? Because in order to participate in this, you have to be able to cut 50 kilowatts of energy per hour for 4 hours, and that's a lot of energy. The second way that it happens is that there is a service called an aggregator service that an entity collects many small homeowners together and asks them to cut energy by texting them. I don't know if you have ever received a text message that says that tomorrow we're going to have this or that or the other. We have calculated that in 5 years, somebody participating in demand response events would be able to get $460 from the government. So what we are trying to do is think, with this $460, like a return on investment of 5 years, can we create a portable system that renters can have in their own home in order to be able to participate in demand response events? A battery and a inverter and a switch and a solar panel can be $500, and therefore we are trying to understand. We're creating a cyber physical system again. We are creating a cybernetic loop in which we are trying to see every battery in a neighborhood, how much charge it has, if there is an event that is going to take place in the future. And we are, by monitoring the charges of batteries, we are able to tell one battery to stop working and wait for the event, another one to charge by the grid, another one, if there is sun available, to continue charging, and so on and so forth. So that creates, in essence, a network of renters that have their own demand response system in their hands. As you can imagine, the cost of it, to the $500 cost, is what creates a plethora of solar panels and batteries to exist in a city. And of course, the benefits of those is not just the demand response, is everyday use of available renewable energy. This is just the beginning. The bet is that we can prove to Con Ed that a system like this can guarantee what they want, so that it can be implemented. Last but not least, it's a project that we are working on an even larger scale, at the urban planning scale. If you think of all of these energy technologies that we have available today, that have the ability, we create buildings that have the ability to collect energy, to metabolize it, to store it, and even share it. So if these buildings are like trees that can do all of these things, we are asking the question is like, what would be the city like of the future? How would the city of the future be different than the city that we have now? So we are creating what we call infomorphism. For historical purposes, we picked this up from Charles Waldheim, who called for a new heliomorphism in 2010, who himself picked up from Ralph Knowles from the 70s and 80s, that he was talking about design through heliomorphism, design through the sun. What we're trying to do is like take this concept and put it at the urban level, at the urban planning level. And what we're saying is that if you evaluate any urban context, you can always map how much energy is available given a shape and orientation, neighbors, and so on. You can also evaluate what is the demand of that energy, because you have density, you have schedules, you have functions, you have things like that are all available through the FAR and the zoning and all of these kinds of things that exist in a building, that exist in a database. And therefore, we are saying that if there is any new neighborhood, can you, on one hand, coordinate the FAR, the maximum building envelope allowed, in order to maximize the amount of energy that can be absorbed by the environment? And at the same time, can you design a local network? What is the minimum length of local energy network that can be designed that will allow exchange between buildings? There are some assumptions that we have here, and that is that energy for a city, we came up with this hypothesis that it's not about every building on its own. It's not about competition. It's not about who can build the most solar panel and so on. Instead, the urban planning rules are governing, let's say, the renewable energy resource as a common. It belongs to the city. It doesn't matter who has it on them. The same way urban planning regulations ensure that everybody has ventilation and everybody has access to sunlight and so on. The same way we imagine that there could be such a thing as an energy right. And the things that we are discovering is that the idea of every building being autonomous, making its own energy, is not the most energy efficient thing. It's more important to understand it as a collective, to understand it as a collection of buildings together, each one making as much energy as it can, and sharing that energy with the other one is a more effective way. Also, it is not necessary that every building, it's actually cheaper if not every building makes its own energy, and some of them are actually getting energy from the grid. We have invented terms like energy rights. An energy neighborhood is an energy of a closed community of energy exchange. We imagine this to become some sort of a complementary to urban planning processes in which whenever you decide on zoning, you understand the energy implications of that. A system like this can suggest that for the same density of people and the same amount of space per function in a city, what would be a distribution that would be more energy efficient based on schedules and so on. Things that we're working further down the line are how to increase the resolution and how to make these forecasts become real time. We are trying to push this to a little bit in a more territorial scale. Let's say when we are looking at oil wells, we consider them to be the leftovers of an industry that is going to die at some point, whether because it's depleted or because it's going to be outlawed. And what it is going to leave behind is a series of holes on the ground. This is Texas. This is an area that is actually oil is starting to deplete. There are many places. It's funny. There are places. There is an eBay for oil wells in which you can buy an abandoned oil well for cheap. What is very interesting about this for us is that because these holes go very deep into the ground, they are very hot. They're actually a very good, they are a very good source of geothermal energy. And geothermal energy, the hole is 95% of the cost of the thing. So we consider this leftover of the industry as a possibility for urbanization because it has free infrastructure. And based on that, we are developing strategies on how to address every single hole based on its depth, the quantity of energy that it has, start dividing sectors, designing streets, and so on and so forth. This is going to come next after we finish with Manhattan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandros. That was for sharing your research work with us. Amazing work, and I'm looking forward to hear more about when you have some questions.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to introduce our next speaker, Galia Solomonov. She's the founder and principal of Solomonov Architecture Studios, SAS. an award-winning firm established in New York in 2004. At SAS, Galia is dedicated to integrating art and architecture and has worked with over 550 internationally recognized artists, designing site-specific multimedia and temporary exhibitions. With artist Robert Irvine, Galia converted a 1929 Nabisco factory into Via Beacon, winning international acclaim and an AIA award. Besides many private projects, SAS designed the Art Alliance in Philadelphia and is doing the Art Master Plan for the Underline in Miami. Through her work and over 60 completed projects, Galia aims to make art accessible to all publics. Solomonov is also the director of Housing Lab and an associate professor of professional practice in architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University. She teaches advanced architectural design and housing, lectures on urban topics, and Latin American architecture. Please all share me welcoming Galia, and please start your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm joining today from Columbia University. We just finished the reviews a bit late, and so I didn't make it back to the office where it will be more quiet. So I hope that you can hear me.
You hear me very well.
Excellent. So I'm going to put the timer at 20 minutes, and I'll stop wherever I get to. Thank you very much for having me here already. Learning a lot from Theodora and Alexandra's presentation, and I look forward to Daniel's presentation as well. So I'm going to go backwards a bit. So I was educated in the Polytechnic School, El Politécnico Superior de Rosario, which is a technical school. And so the relationship with automation and collective comes from high school. The high school that I went to, it was an engineering high school that had all these different disciplines from wood, metal, aluminum, all these different techniques. And and of course we drew by hand. And at that moment, the tendency or the machines that we used were to make things as precisely rectilinear as possible. And the other machine that I think is pertinent in this discussion is the Theodolito, this machine for measuring the ground, and the machine that you have on your left is the machine that we used in the 1980s, late 80s, in this school, and it required a plumb. And of course, many pages of calculation just to plot a simple plot of land. It would take the entire class, 3 people, an entire 12 weeks, just to kind of move the machine through a terrain for a house. Of course, nowadays, those cosine sine calculations are not needed. One basically points and press a button, and one can plot all the lines. And then from the environment of Rosario, Argentina during the military dictatorship, I came to New York, also in the late 80s, and I encountered a very different collective where the machine was at a very kind of the crossroads between machines and drugs had made things very bitter for New York. And one culture or one collective that I was part of at that moment was the punk movement that basically used anything from guitars and microphones for the expression of the negative expression of the machine, the crying of the machine, the distortion of the machine. And so that was the environment. And the environment that also hosted me was the art community, the Soho art community of the early 90s. That was a community very focused on the negative the negative connotations of the machine and the difficulties with it. First, I went to City College, and then I went to Columbia. And I want to talk 1 minute about Columbia in the 90s. I was a student 92 to 95. And at that moment, I was the first paperless studio. And so we transitioned from using DOS system, where we needed to input all the numbering, to using Form C and being able to modulate space. And so at that moment, now when you talk about the blob, it has a very negative ring. But at that moment, it was a liberation of the straight line. And it was a very, we were invested in the curvilinear. And this is just a graph of the collective in the 90s and the collectives now. And so I'm going to show a couple of projects that relate between the School of Architecture and my practice. And so after Columbia, I worked at OMA, and there I engaged another collective that had another ring to it. And the aim there was to build. So to move the concepts. There was a lot of people from Columbia University at that moment. I think we were more than half of the personnel at OMA in the late 90s, 97, 98, 2000, were Columbia grads. And at that moment, what we were trying to do is to do a physical, to build the things that we had been modeling. One of the projects that I did right after OMA was this project called Effective Brick. It had started with Jesse Reiser, who was a professor at Columbia in the 90s. And the idea was to take the brick, the oldest building unit, to the expressive end, the end point of the brick. And I was coming from the tradition of Eladio Diestes, thinking about bricks as something, a way to do curvilinear and supple forms using the oldest technology. And so I developed, and they're called effective because they're not, I don't think of them as a progression of the brick. I think of a detour, an expressive detour, a forceful detour. And so we developed these first digitally, but then at that moment, this is 1999, 2000, there was no way of casting these large. And so we modeled them 3D, but then we reproduced them by hand and then cast them in the oldest way. We made a mold. The mold that you see here could only cast about 60 units, and then the mold would be no longer useful. So we casted about 300 units, and we did this construction, and this was shown at an artist space, not a gallery, an artist collective, and that was my collective at that moment, the relationship with artists. And that took me to work with Dia and Dia Beacon and the artists there. And I want to show one project that we worked on. So of course, Warhol is the person that you think when you think about repurposing the machine for expressive purposes, and Serra, when you think about the shipyards that no longer are shipyards but become sculpture gardens or sculpture machines. And of course, these units, torque ellipses, are just put on the ground. They're not structurally attached to the ground. And so the geometry has to be such that cannot vibrate or tilt. And then the project that I want to describe is a project with Michael Heiser, with whom I worked on and off in a number of projects. And so this project, Monolith, is a 7-ton unit of granite that is placed in the sheetrock. And so here the architectural kind of collaboration or the collective was to find a way to hold the granite in place without showing the supports. And so when I see this, I didn't work on this. This is Michael Heiser at LACMA. And when you see the rock, when you see this, the supports are expressed, are shown. And so I think here, this kind of tension between the machine, the automatic production of the steel that supports the granite and the granite are revealed, I think, to the detriment of the experience of weight and the energy of these immense mass. And so the project that I want to share with you is this north, south, east, west. This is the drawing that was produced by Michael Heiser in 1960, I think 66. And this is the way it was built. And so it's basically a 20-foot drop in the ground. And the part that is relevant for this discussion is the edge. And so the edge, these are the forms in the basement. The edge is, this is a detail that we developed with the knowledge that I had from high school of, so Michael Heiser wanted the encounter of the curtain steel and the cement to be completely machine made, to feel like nothing had been done by hand. But how do you get concrete to make a sharp edge with curtain steel without using, so how do you do it so that it has that kind of perfect machine finish? And so the way you do it is with applying a lot of heat very fast at the edge. And so when we did that, so we did that drop, then pour the last 4 inches and then trowel it by hand very quickly with towels so that water would evaporate and the edge would be very sharp and neat. And that's kind of the result. I'm not going to talk about this, but I'm going to now go through 4 projects with the students at Columbia. So the effective brief was done with the students at Columbia when I was an adjunct in 2000 and 2001. These projects, this is 2011, a portable bathroom and a screen and a cover, an inflatable cover. And so here the process was done 20 students, 12 weeks a semester, and built by the students. So it's not just the thing you do, but it's the way who you do it with. And so I think in this moment where students are so detached from making things by hand, from the weight of things, from the drawing of things, from measuring things, it's really important to reintroduce the making of things and the weight of things. And so in order to have inflatables at Columbia, you have to anchor them because they're very dangerous. They could fly away. And so they require steel. And so this is steel that then gets installed, and I'll show you where it gets installed. And so the collective part of the part that needs to go, I really like Theodora's explanation of what was done by hand, what was done by the computer. And so here the atmosphere of building and creating a party around building was as important as the building itself. And this is the party, the kind of inauguration party of the inflatable. And then in 2021, during the pandemic, the dean decided to do another inflatable to celebrate that we were coming back to campus. And so this is the outside project with Laurie Hawkinson. and also 12 students. Again, this needs to be done, built from scratch in 12 weeks. So it needs to be designed in 3 weeks so that it can be manufactured and deployed and permitted, because the permitting process is part of this process too. And so we go through very quickly in a week through hundreds of precedents of temporary pavilions and military constructions to determine processes to build. We do a measuring with the digital theodolite so that we have a survey of the surfaces. And then we do a parametric design and rhino models, and we develop a 3D frame for the inflatables. And then these get fragmented into pieces, and solar panels are applied to them in the right locations. I'm not showing today the solar studies of where they go. Every year is different. The materials every year are different. Some years we've done platforms. There is a steel that will hold the inflatables from the inside. There is inflatable arriving and the inflatable being erected and inflated. And it's a lot of fun. It's a beautiful sense of lightness to create this. And we pair this with furniture. These are reclaimed wood that we picked up from a gardening supply place and made these benches and platforms. And the circles that you see in the ground are the 60 inches that we were supposed to be separated by. And then there's rain chains to collect the rain. We use it at graduation, movie screenings, yoga. And then last year we did this other one also with Lori Hawkinson, different group of 12 students, 20 students in this year. And this one, here we wanted to do a one that was rain, that would protect us from the rain, which is very common in May when we graduate. And here also the pattern was part of the design. The furniture is always part of the design too. The furniture function as chair and table. And it has a very festive quality and kind of a relationship to the 1960s and all the inflatables that were then. And now we are doing 3 small inflatables this year. The idea is to do with recyclable materials and to do them off the grid, solar power ones. And so these are charging stations and dancing booths. And so we're doing 3 very small ones. These are 12 by 12 by 13. And that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you for sharing your beautiful work. Now I want to come to your graduation in your canopy this year.
Please. I would love to. The more the merrier. It's outdoors. So it's going to be May 13 is our party.
Okay.
The inflatable should arrive tomorrow, and we're erecting Saturday and Sunday.
Beautiful. Okay, so last but not least, we'll move on to our last speaker, Daniel Cardoso. I also have the pleasure to know Daniel as well as Alexander and Theodora from MIT. And Daniel is, also kind of like he was kind of one of our mentors because he was already out in academia and we're still studying. So yes, so Daniel Cardoso is associate professor, School of Architecture in Carnegie Mellon University. His lecture is going to be Robots in the Loop, Reconfigurations of Construction Automation. And so let me read his bio. So Daniel is the chair of the Computational Design Graduate Program and co-directs the Code Lab. He's author of publications, exhibitions, and artifacts exploring critical histories and practices of automation and computing in design and architecture, including the book Builders of the Vision, Software and the Imagination of the Design, and the forthcoming book Designing the Computational Image, Imagining Computational Design with Theodora. Daniel's work has been supported by the Graham Foundation for the Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, Canada Social Science and Humanities Research Council, Google's Artist Plus, Machine Intelligence Program, among others. And he's also a 2021-22 Pennsylvania Manufacturing Fellow and founding co-editor of the Design, Technology and Society Routledge book series. And he holds a PhD and an MS with honors from MIT and BArch from Universidad de los Andes at his native Bogota. So please, Daniel.
Thank you, Athena. I'm going to try sharing my screen. Tell me, please, if things are working. Are you able to see my slide?
Yes.
Great. So thank you again for the introduction, the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Today, I will not be talking so much about my scholarship, which has focused on, as you mentioned, developing historical and sort of socio-technical perspectives on design technologies, in particular by looking at the computational reimagination of design that happened in conjunction with some of the earliest computer graphics and numerical control systems in the 50s and 60s. Instead, I will try to discuss some of our more applied or experimental work here at the Computational Design Lab at Carnegie Mellon, which broadly seeks to mobilize some of those critical understandings of technology and to sort of bring them into the context of experimental, speculative technologies for designing, for building, and so on. So before focusing, so I will focus my talk on one specific project. Before delving into that, I will give a quick overview of some of the different strands of work in our group, in particular those that connect to questions of well, directly like machine learning and AI techniques and so on. And I would like to kind of pose them as happening along these three kind of strands of work. On the one hand, the first is something I like to call architectural distant readings. This is a sort of a question or an inquiry around what architectural and urban heritage, morphological analysis, and history, how may those questions change when seen through the lens of large collections of data, right? And some of the work that we've developed in that space has investigated the kinds of questions that we may ask of large collections of architectural data, questions about the representation and understanding of typological change, morphological change across urban contexts, and so on. So for example, in this project, we used 3D reconstruction techniques to create a custom data set of hundreds of wooden churches, which are located within the Carpathian mountain region of the Eastern Europe in Ukraine, basically. And then use deep learning methods to kind of characterize and reveal unexpected sort of formal traits in this specific typology. In this particular project, we also use deep learning techniques to sort of rethink our understanding of the urban fabric of Pittsburgh. We develop a new kind of basically data structure to represent urban space that takes into account not just individual buildings, but also their surrounding spaces. And with that data set, we're able to ask different kinds of questions about the morphology of the city and to create a new kind of gradient map of the urban context of the place. The second strand is experimental design and making tools, which broadly looks at sort of new kinds of design interfaces that involve gestural or embodied modes of interaction between designers and makers with design representations or materials. So in this particular project, this is led by one of our PhD students, Ardon Dijboli. He worked collaboratively with a musician playing santur, which is a traditional Persian instrument, to develop a sort of custom performance companion robot. There's no time to go into detail, but a lot of what I think is important about this project in relation to the topic of today's conversation is that a lot of the attention was paid into the kind of dynamic between the performer and the technologies, and the roles were sort of a little blurred in terms of who is a tool developer, a user, and so on. Other projects at the master's level tend to kind of take a playful approach to kind of rethinking the different kinds of agencies in design and making and so on in this project. It's about playfully exploring different configurations of human and machine agency in embroidery, right? So it's not architecture, right? But it's an exploration of algorithmic and human creativity. So finally, I want to kind of narrow in on the project that I wanted to discuss, in part because I think speaks more directly to the topic of the session today. Also, it's a project that is ongoing, so it's not quite finished, and you will notice that I'll be very open to kind of questions and comments about it. It's rethinking automation in construction, which is our aspiration, and it's about exploring the confluence of artificial intelligence and robotics to enable more adaptive systems in support of construction. And the goal is to maybe change the conversation a little bit from construction automation into something I like to call robotically supported cooperative construction. It's a project that is very collaborative with industry and with different sponsors, working with faculty and students in the School of Engineering and Robotics and Architecture. That's one of the exciting and challenging parts of this project. So here we're interested in fostering sort of modes of work that do not simply seek more efficient or faster forms of construction, but more humane ways of people to be supported by robots in the context of building. We're interested in how semi-autonomous technologies may be used to support construction activities in ways that recognize the inherent complexity of construction sites and that value existing forms of expertise and work. And that's why it's called robot in the loop. We've all heard the expression human in the loop to refer to the idea that somehow artificial intelligence method can do away without the presence of humans. But here, instead, we seek to emphasize the robot in the loop as a scenario where, quote unquote, autonomous robots play assistive roles in the context of building. Basically, instead of reducing the complexity of construction to something a robot can do, we want to create a system that is adaptive enough to operate more likely in contexts that are well-formed and already complex. At a technical level, we're using machine learning, which is what most people really mean when they say AI these days. And in particular, our project employs reinforcement learning, which is a particular genre of ML that focuses on learning by trial and error and by interacting with external and dynamic environments. So, as many of you know, historically, industrial robots have relied on pre-programmed instructions or direct human control. Reinforcement learning opens up the possibility of computational agents to act in a more responsive and stepwise manner to changing environmental factors or to changing inputs. And I think that this has the potential to work well in construction environments, which are they're not factories, they're not kind of assembly lines. Buildings are more complex by their very nature and scale. So our initial experiments consisted in imagining and simulating a series of agents with a series of macro actions that could dynamically be assigned based on factors such as the real-time locations of other agents, certain resources and materials, we equip them in the simulations with a LiDAR sensor, basically a way to collect information over the 3D environment, and with awareness of the velocities and of the other agents. To be clear, the roads in the simulation are not following a predefined trajectory. They're sort of finding their way in response to kind of the changing conditions of that very environment. And that seemed to us like a promising sort of avenue to continue to explore. So the simulations were promising, and the method or the approach seemed suitable to more complex environments, because that was, of course, a very simplistic and idealized version of a construction environment. It was very simple. There was no people. The activities were very idealized versions of construction tasks, like brick placing and pick and place and spray coating and so on. So these limitations sort of led us to think of the project in a different way that allowed us to go from simulations to prototypes and from the lab to actual construction sites. And then the project's goal became then to really rethink the idea of construction automation to robotically supported construction. And the first step to do that was to rethink the architecture of the project, the conceptual architecture of the project, to include a significant component of qualitative studies of construction sites. The team included ethnographers who spent around 15 weeks exploring different construction sites here in Pittsburgh, collecting data in the form of interviews, field notes, videos, and photographs, which helped the team create a sort of richer portrait of specific construction practices and narrow in on particular scenarios for potential support. And the technical frameworks that we're developing are shaped by that portrait and try to speak to those specific communities of practice that we engaged with. And so the goal, what we're working towards and hoping to demonstrate this pretty soon in May, is an open source technical framework that enables a robot to conduct autonomous navigation for material and tool delivery in a construction floor for the particular tasks of carpentry formwork and framing. It should be sort of collision avoiding and sort of safe, but also we want to understand the reception of this kind of technology with particular workers. So we will be testing these on construction sites. These are some images that sort of give a flavor about the types of analysis and data that we collected. This is a snapshot of the technical architecture, a very simplified version of the technical architecture of the project that involves modules for navigation, for mapping, for pedestrian detection, and for reinforcement learning, which is a big part of what the technical innovation here is about. The robot itself, after testing many hardware platforms, was a ClearPath Husky robot, which is this little rover. We chose it because it's well documented, it's fairly stable compared to the others that we tried, and it was also available, I should say. So we worked on the project. It seemed suitable for the open source architecture that we were aiming for. All elements of the project comprise the interfaces, phone apps, and also like a soft keypad for workers to be able to command the robot without having to take off their gloves and so on. And here you can see a sense, like a little snapshot of the different kind of technical elements of the project. On the left side, you see the robot moving around. It's being driven by one of the members of the team. And on the right, you see the kind of the LiDAR generated point cloud of our lab at Mid-19 here at CMU. Here we see different tests of the robot already showing collision avoidance with tall obstacles. And this is a bit of a history of the project. The robot, in this case, I want to note that the robot is finding its way as we see it, is not really pre-programmed to go to follow a specific path. It's giving a starting point and an end point, and it's kind of finding its way through different obstacles. One interesting, important challenge was to combine different kinds of sensor input, like LiDAR, 3D point clouds, and 2D sensors had to be combined in order to account for low obstacles, which are very common in construction sites. So this is different from an autonomous vehicle, like a conventional autonomous vehicle research, in the sense that construction sites have specific spatial and material characteristics that we needed to take into account. Here we can see the robot's own map finding its way in a longer sort of trajectory. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to go a little quickly. Here we see the robot's first attempts to kind of move around groups of people. In general, these tests have been successful. But we are working on the final sort of element of the technical architecture of the project, which is to incorporate the reinforcement learning module, which operates as a sort of critic on the detection and tracking system of the robot. It's the simulation suggests that it will be successful, but we're in the process of integrating that into the hardware, and hopefully next week we'll have a little more information about that. Next steps include demonstrating this. Again, the idea of collective automation, like what are these systems, who are these systems for, and who are they meant to support? Here we try to stay close to the idea of automation technologies that are assistive of existing ecologies of practice, rather than automation technologies that completely reconfigure a community of practice or sort of disrupt a community of practice. And that's kind of the goal of the project. If you hear screams, it's my 3-year-old daughter who's having trouble going to sleep. I hope it's not too loud. And yeah, so that's kind of the outline of the project. As you can see, it's kind of in process. There's a few publications already out that I'll be happy to share later on. But I wanted to zoom out before finishing the talk and reflect on this project in light of the broader question of collective automation and the kind of conceptual or pedagogical sort of elements that may be at stake here, right? So I'd like to offer 3 points for discussion. One is data as a design material, something that is often forgotten. Computational methods, things we call AI today, are essentially fancy statistical techniques, and therefore their effectiveness fundamentally depends on the data that we use. But data, it's important to remember, is not inherently truthful or neutral, but it's always responding to specific cultures of record keeping and habits of representation and specific spatial and cultural settings. So their construction, collection, curation, and manipulation are important arenas for creative and critical engagement. And I think that's really important for people in our field, in architecture, to think creatively about how these data are being produced and collected, and how we use them to kind of fuel these algorithmic engines. The second one is the idea of disciplinary and methodological hybrids. I think computational methods, as we all know, have always worked in conjunction with other knowledge domains, and I think all of the presentations today were incredibly insightful and powerful in expressing that multidisciplinarity of our practices. So I think that this hybrid sensibility across spatial, material, and computational literacies is essential to kind of confront this emerging landscape of technologies, not only in a passive way, but also with full conscience that we can also shape it and direct it. And it's also our job to think about it as architects and to design it as architects. Third one is a thought about these fantasies of effortless and autonomous design that are inundating our social media feeds and studio reviews and so on. And the idea of AI techniques and automation techniques as these kind of surrogates or replacements for particular skills in design. And I think that the opportunity, I think it's more promising to think of the opportunity to design interfaces that critically afford transparency over those systems. And I think Theodora's last few slides also kind of try to address this question from a different angle, right? How can we develop critical interfaces that afford new kinds of transparency, of exploration, or even of obfuscation? And I think this requires that we recognize these systems as socio-technical and that we build into them modes of interruption, intervention, and slowdown, and visualization that afford user space for reflexive thinking, that expose their algorithmic machineries and the visions of work that they inscribe. And with that, I'd like to finish this very short talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. See, we knew you're going to have like these 3 discussion points. That's why we put you last. I have a lot of thoughts and ideas and comments, but I want to give the opportunity maybe for like our guests or the rest of the panel to start with a question.
Maybe just to keep us started and maybe try to make correlations between the different themes that were presented today. I think this is very interesting, the different focus, and we always like, one of the structures that I like introducing in NYIT lectures is not to have one presentation, not to have pairs of presentation, but to have 4. And the idea of having 4 is to look at different issues from different angles and try to make the intellectual effort of making a construction that may be useful other than just reading your text online or reading your research in relationship to their focus, but start tracing relationships among different problems. One issue that I find very interesting in relationship to Theodora, that we can talk hours about the problem of the graph, right? The graph theory and the relation between the graph in relationship to the computable system. Theodora said something that is very important, what is more important, the mathematical model of the graph or the computational system that enable to put it in motion. That to me is one aspect that I would like to see, because it's not only an issue of representation, it's an issue of cognition. And in the last presentation by Daniel, for instance, we are one of the discussions that I keep everybody in mind, because when we do machine learning, the data outweighs the model, right? So the difference, the paradigmatic change in artificial intelligence, let's say, is that we were modeling things before, and now we're not really modeling anymore, but we're using data as a way of challenging our notions of model through statistic design. So in that sense, the relationship between the graph as a structure, as a cognitive structure, versus data as a pragmatic way of approaching reality based on existing data, to me is a very interesting problem to discuss on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the issue of Galia brought in that I find very interesting, which is the problem of weight in architecture, which is a cognitive issue that is very difficult to comprehend, because if you don't address the tectonic of the materials and the weight that architecture deals with, which is in reality, the politics of architecture is the weight of the structure, right? And how to overcome the weight of the structure. And then the issue of energy in relationship to information that Alex brought in. So to me, the 4 points that have been made this evening are very interesting I just wonder where we are today, and I think I am also developing an environmental system that has to do with equity and representation through a blockchain system. So how are we thinking about developmentalism, right? Because architecture cannot keep developing the way it has been doing. We have a crisis that I think people are starting to understand that it's a correlational crisis. It's not only what we know is going to happen, but things that we do not know that are going to happen that are the problem. So I wonder, in terms of these 4 points that were presented today, how we start crossing relationships in terms of, for instance, the issue of the structure, the issue of the data, the energy use in the relation between the structure and the data, and the issue of weight in architecture, which is the politics of architecture. So I don't know, it's not really a particular question to anybody, but I would like to think of possible crossing and articulations in terms of the 4 conversations, so that we can actually, the idea is to build up something that we cannot get somewhere else, right? In terms of crossing the 4 voices. So anybody, if you want to jump in and perhaps clarify your position in relationship to the other panelists as well.
Just I want to take the opportunity to add one more point that I found like very much connecting all the talks, and something that I reflect a lot about is how you refer, like, so Theodora referred about the graph that was hidden but somehow more intuitive than the AI black box. And then we talked about the collective and regarding automation, but like kind of like responding to the user in the city in the case of Alex, and then the collective, again, the agency between the collective and the material in the installations of Galia, and then again the idea of robotic interaction or collaboration, or like, how do you call it, like supported construction as opposed to automation in the case of Daniel. So the question of agency, I think it's very critical, especially now with AI like being very prominent in the kind of design studios. So I thought that was another interesting link, and this like that comes up between all the talks. So you're free to talk whatever point we like throw in onto you.
I'll jump in and say something. I think that the idea of weight resonated, that Paulo mentioned. The weight as the politics of architecture, and in relation to labor, for example, that's the question of labor as those who are pulling the weight, and it's something that gets lost sometimes in our understanding of how architecture gets produced for important cultural and legal reasons, right? Architecture is not usually concerned with that, but I think the weight of it is something that has me thinking, and will probably, it certainly has been central to the shaping of our project, the choice of robotic platform, the interaction with the workers that we are collaborating with for the project, moving things around in a construction site, doing that in a way that is easier, and so on. I think that's one part where I think there's an interesting connection there, weight and labor.
I don't know if Theodora, if you want to say anything more, because you said something that is a little bit subtle, I think, and I'm not sure if people pick it up on it, but you made a construction that is a little bit controversial in a way, in the relationship between the graph and also graph theory in relationship to automation. I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit more on that, and in relationship to what Danielle presented, for instance.
Yes, I can try, and just thank you again for all these wonderful talks. And I think so many things resonated. I absolutely agree. The notion of weight, Alex's matter of fact and matter of fiction, I thought was also a very interesting framework through thinking about, well, I mean, computation as also, and automation as producing fictions and frontiers for our discipline. So, I mean, obviously, a major debate in computing in AI has been that question of representation. And in fact, there's been competing cultures within AI that have a very long history in thinking about that question of whether AI is a kind of humanist project where through trying to systematize or automate processes, you understand them better. And so that assumes a kind of idea of modeling, of representation, of legibility, this kind of idea that the systems and the abstractions that you produce need to be able to be read back, need to have this kind of evocative and almost kind of fictive qualities in certain ways, versus the more kind of results-oriented, which at MIT, like the kind of old school AI that many of us trained in, I guess would call the kind of engineering approach, that what gives validity to a system are the fact that it can produce results, like not so much a kind of idea of a model, which I mean, there's also just such interesting literature in thinking about models as fictions. Like I'm thinking about kind of Matthew Hunter's kind of more recent article, but also in the history of science, this idea that what models produce are kind of like stories and rules to be followed, that they're kind of generative in those ways. And so that the legibility of a model is a kind of fundamental aspect. And so, I mean, I was just trying, you know, when I started thinking about graphs, they were still very much being used. I guess I was thinking about, well, I mean, just a few years ago, like still kind of these ideas of automated floor planning and space allocation, which were kind of like researching in architecture as this kind of like old visions that were now kind of becoming again possible through kind of more data and better algorithms. But I think lately I've had to contend with this quite radical departure from these kind of like pristine structural abstractions of architectural space or design to just the kind of proliferation of these much more kind of obfuscated large models where the interest is not so much in like how they work, but like really what they output. And that has shifted the conversation quite a bit from a discussion about, representational qualities and validity and the validity of the model, to its results. So I've been trying to kind of think about these current questions through some of this historical work. I don't know if that answered it, I guess, probably not, but these are just some thoughts, I just wanted to maybe say as an anecdote, I mean, I remember at MIT, and maybe Athena and Daniel and Alex, maybe they were all part of it. There was a few years ago a symposium on the 50 years of the AI lab at MIT, where various kind of figures like Noam Chomsky and Patrick Winston and other figures were sort of invited to talk about, to reflect back on what they called the kind of golden years of AI. And I remember Chomsky bringing up that question of what counts as knowledge, and this idea that if you kind of have a bee flying around a flower, you could have a kind of causal model that allows you to understand that relationship between the bee and the flower, which would allow you to then kind of predict future behaviors. But because you've understood the relationship between those entities, or a statistical model that plots every single position of the bee, and through that plotting can kind of statistically predict the next position. And he was bringing up that point of like what would count as valid knowledge. And I found it kind of interesting because just the answer, I think, would be very different. I mean, it's very likely that today the latter would count as valid knowledge, but it also spoke a little bit about this tradition and this commitment to representation and models and kind of causal relationships as being something that was very important in computing this kind of structural abstraction. But today, there seems to be a kind of shifting set of priorities and concerns.
You know, to me, it's very interesting in relationship to Theodora and Daniel, Alex and Galia, the issue of energy and weight. Because the interesting thing about Alex, the validation system of Alex is the feedback problem of the thermostat, right? which is a principle of also, right, of a different type of knowledge, right? So I wonder, it's very interesting, Alex, what you presented about the problem of the electrical grid, which we're also looking at, right? The validation system of how the efficiency of the network, right, in relationship to the distribution, capturing, right, is like a completely different validation system. So I'm glad, Theodora, that you're mentioning the different problems of knowledge, because I think that there are four very different issues of knowledge presented. So I wonder if Alex or Galia, you want to share anything in terms of that.
I want to just add that, yes, weight can translate into energy and be eliminated as a variable. But I think that that's the tendency. The tendency is to reduce things to one thing: energy, money. Of course, everything, most things in life right now can be reduced to money or energy, and they end up being the same thing. But at the same time, when you confront the bee, when you confront the flower, you realize that you reduce the flower and the bee. And the same thing happens when students see a beam that they know how much it weighs, but to carry that beam, and they know 4 people are not enough, they need 6. But when they encounter the beam, it's a different, even you cannot reduce it anymore. It becomes a larger issue. And I think that this is where beauty, and I'm so, the biggest compliment that anyone can tell me when I finish a presentation is beautiful. And thank you very much. Because I think that's the thing that I don't want to reduce. And I want to find ways of using all the things that we're doing to scream and to do something beautiful. Screaming is as important for our culture right now as it is to function. And I think we have a moment where the machine is silencing a lot. And so I think the issue of the malfunctioning machine, the robot that doesn't find its path, that creates a traffic jam, is to be taken on. I don't know, I wouldn't say celebrated or work on, but it's something. The beautiful and the beastie are needed.
Well, let me jump in a little bit. I will pick up on the issue of waste and of weight, and something that Pablo, you mentioned about development, I think, or keep developing, keep adding. One thing about weight, it's measurable, and therefore we can evaluate it the same way with energy, the same way with data. All of these things are measurable. Daniel mentioned data as a new material. It's exactly that. It's our newest type of infrastructure that we have to deal with, and we have to manipulate and coordinate the same way we manipulate material and we manipulate energy. What is important to me to point out is that the same way we know about the weight of a material, we also know the weight of the machine that extracted that material, and we also know most of the times the conditions under which people worked in order to extract that material, and the fuel that we spent to move it from here to there. Therefore, weight represents not just the concentrated data point of a single thing. It automatically means a landscape, if you will, an environment, or a supply chain in this case. So minimizing weight is a symbol for understanding how we can rearticulate those ecologies, economies, systems, if you will. To go back to the point of development, population is growing, and also standards of living are increasing. And I don't believe that anybody wants neither of those things to happen, or there's anything we can do about it. Actually, we would welcome both, I imagine. Therefore, we need to address population growth, and we need to address standards of living that are higher. When we minimize weight, we might be adding things, but if we collectively think about it, we are adding less, not more. And because things come in cycles and nothing lasts forever, eventually things are going to be less than they are today, even if you count them and they are more. The same thing is happening with energy. It's not about any single system and so on. Is understanding that behind any technology, there is an economic model, there is an opportunity to create a new economy, there is an opportunity to create a different kind of social engagement, and that is through the design of a dumb thing like a radiator, or a sensor that tells you when to turn on and when to turn off your system. So I wouldn't say not keep adding. I would say that the next time we add, we make sure we reconfigure at the same time. We don't take for granted the politics of the way things are happening, the streams of material, the way they're happening, the streams of energy, the way they're happening, and so on. So anytime we count something, we have the opportunity to reconfigure it at the same time at the systems level. That's how I think about it. Theodora, I wanted to ask you something. I enjoyed all presentations. I also learned a lot by you. I wanted to ask you something because you keep teaching all of us the lineage of computation, and I really enjoy reading your things and like hearing you because you trace them. I wanted to ask you, as an intuition, if nothing else, has anything changed fundamentally from when when the computation in architecture, computation in space was conceived until today, other than the fact that we can do it more, faster, more complex, and so on? Has anything shifted in the way we are doing it, or are we still doing the same thing, but, better, faster, cheaper, or whatever, all of these kinds of things? Do you have an intuition about this?
Well, thanks, Alex. First of all, I don't think I would be in a position. I mean, I can give you my personal opinion, but
yeah, that's what I want.
Yes, but I feel that I'm really part of a field. So, for instance, I'm not the only one tracing the lineages. I feel kind of collaborators like Daniel, and in fact, I think that's part of the hope that we can think of an expansive field of kind of thinking about the history of computation and the digital as ever-shifting thing, because all contemporary concerns might shift the context that we're analyzing and thinking about. And just really, I feel it's an ever-expansive endeavor, because, where does data end? I mean, as Daniel was just discussing, I mean, record-keeping practices have such a long history, kind of the idea of what to consider data and information. So, I mean, like, really, I feel it's a really vast field. So it would really be kind of a hubris for me to kind of claim any kind of position in saying how things are. But I guess your question is part of what motivates, I think, also for many of us, I feel that desire to go back to the past. I mean, in my book, I'm using this idea of the skeleton and this idea of the ghost and the haunting as a way to talk about how that past might persist in our present. I don't think, obviously, it would be very reductive to claim that things are continuous completely or that nothing has changed. I mean, I think we can definitely trace the persistence of some of the fictions and frontiers that were laid out in these early experiments as still being very much present in discursive or technical formations around computing. So ideas about seamlessness, as Daniel was just bringing up, automation, these kind of questions about messy data and pristine kind of algorithmic abstractions. I think there's a lot to think through. And in those histories, because some of the I guess it might be the historical distance, but also the scale of this project is a little bit more tractable. Like you can trace them to specific settings, to specific kind of institutional contexts. Today, there's such a kind of proliferation, like everything, like information is everywhere, everything is digital, like the machine is everywhere. So it's a little bit, maybe because we're living it, it's a little bit harder to take the distance that is required. So I really liked your idea about fictions and that each of these projects also produces a fiction. It produces desired future, a kind of version of our present, and that has an effect. I mean, these are staying fictions, and very often I think this question of rhetoric is quite important for me as well, because one of the reasons that I'm so interested in graphs are also as these like very recognizable devices that gave computation a very specific image at that time and kind of allowed a very particular imagination of what it means to kind of abstract and represent space and architecture and compute with it meant. So yeah, I just feel that very often the historical work allows us to, I mean, very often there's a kind of idea either of just really seeing very clearly kind of persistent tropes, which, then we can kind of recognize and unpack. And I think often another reaction that I have when, for instance, like students are confronted with some of these histories is a sort of techno-nostalgic, like, because there was a sort of like openness and a kind of boldness in some of these early projects that today seems to have dissipated in a little bit more kind of pragmatic.
Yes.
But I'd love to hear what Daniel thinks about that, because I very much see Daniel as a collaborator and kind of participant in all of these questions. So yeah, Pablo. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would agree, like through the lens of my own historical work, it's very clear how the conceptual skeleton, to use your word, Theodora, or the conceptual scaffolding of today's architectural computing was laid out in the 50s. And it wasn't architects. It was a coalition of engineers, mathematicians, and so on, who worked together to envision a new context for design, where the agencies were kind of redistributed and reimagined in different ways. There's not one way, there's different ways. But those tropes persist, and architects sort of engaged with those tropes and added to those tropes a series of very interesting and appealing sort of visions. But to me, it's fascinating to see that kind of collusion of big technological projects, government-funded technological projects, it needs to be said. These were labs that were funded by military kind of interests and government interests to bring together manufacturing and design in the context of computing, right? And those created a lot of interest within research universities, and architects were like moths to the light and invented in conversation with those technological projects the kinds of visions that we continue to inhabit today. And I find that fascinating and interesting. And I don't want to kind of place too much agency in the kind of these large technological projects, but I think the history of computer-aided design and numerical control shows us that there is a dialectic relationship between those large projects and political projects and particular cultural practices. And we're part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say very briefly that when I see the 50s and I see your presentations, and I see the own trajectory of a place like GSAP, Columbia University, I think the dreamers, the people that dream about technology 50, 60, 20 years ago were more, and people used to dream about the future. I think people now have nightmares about the future. The majority of us are preoccupied with these things, and I think that has changed. The tools, the way we think, the way we work together, it's similar, but but I think this sense, the kind of open potential of things have shifted from problem solving and a more optimistic view, dreaming of things, to a more nightmarish and controlling, and maybe more aware of the negative impulses of society. But that's my preoccupation. I see a lot of students very preoccupied.
I think, Galia, that I partially agree with what you're saying. One of the issues is, and I think it's a very interesting problem. I would shift a little bit what you just said, because one of the issues is that today is everything about problem solving. I think it's the other way around. The data is actually confirming the nightmare problem that you're talking about. Is actually confirming the bias, and that's where we are struggling, I think. And I am optimistic in the sense that I believe that we are in a very interesting time, because we are looking at ourselves in the mirror. And I think that the interesting thing about what Theodora opened up, which is, by the way, I'm publishing my book on artificial intelligence, coming up soon. And one of the issues that I'm interested in is the Lacanian mirror, right? The issue that I think what Theodora picked up, which I think Alex is picking up also, is whether it was better or not. To me, the problem is that the graph theory, that this particular graph theory that Theodora presented, develop a map and a territory through a system of representation. And that system of representation nailed the problem so well that then the computational system is just addressing it. And then the graph is in a higher cognition level than the computational system implemented to resolve that level. And I think that that's when mathematics is usually 200, 500 years ahead, because the mathematics of the relation of the graph overweight the computational system used to implement it. And I think that that's when Alex is saying, are we better or not? And I think that that's why in the realm of possibilities on systems that we have today, very few are nailing on the issue of the media determinism, which is that if you figure out a way to do things, you have to be aware that you're proposing a model and a bias, even if the data that you're funneling through the model is going to either outweigh or not, because the data algorithm or the data gathering method that you use becomes the message, right? So the data, as Daniel also well pointed out, is not only the data is weighted or data is biased. It's also that the graph theory or the system that we use to implement the data already has other problems. So to me, what I'm trying to figure out, or the discussion in the book, is the relationship between the two and when and how one awaits the other. And I think that Theodora presented that issue very clearly. And I think that it was maybe a little bit too sophisticated and too pointed as a question. But I think that to me, the issue is the relation between that and energy. How do you deal with that, right? When energy actually proposes a totally different network system in which the flow is what validates the system. Because if you lose a little bit of energy, then you have to change entirely the system, and then the graph is totally wasted. And also Theodora, Alexander Klein, right, was working on this issue in the 1930s. And I think that we were talking with Nelson is here, the problem of Germany, how Germany outweighed the data issue, right? And I think it's an interesting problem that we are now catching up with, but unfortunately, the Nazi Germany were very aware of the problems of probabilistic theory, and I think now we're falling into that trap. And I think people are not just aware of that issue. I think of what Galia, you're saying, the terrifying notion is what I have the problem with Patrick Schumacher, right? That Patrick Schumacher doesn't see that as a problem. I think that is the problem.
Maybe Patrick is the problem.
Yes, I know. Well,
I had a question for the panel, if that's okay.
yes.
Yeah, there's this notion. I mean, I think to go back to Theodora, the sort of Stanford from California, we talk a lot about like the Stanford Computer Lab, the Computer Club, right? What sort of invented modern computing as a very simple process, really, of student obsession with this idea of technology. I was curious, all of the projects from everyone involved student work. right, involved the technical labor to some extent falling on 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds with the limited technical experience who are able to produce many of the beautiful visuals that we saw today in everyone's presentation. I'm curious, when we talk about sort of algorithmic agency, what role we as practitioners and we're trying to stamp these ideas into the history of architectural knowledge, right? What role we play in passing that sort of simple take, right? I mean, I remember I was advising a project in which they used the ant method, right, for motion movement, right, which is like technically AI by every metric, but one of the worst systems for object movement ever, right? What role do practitioners play in student-led, very technical math-led research? I think that's something I'm curious to hear any thoughts on.
You're describing the Kutz algorithm, right? The ant movement. Yeah.
Sure. As students who might come in to solve one of the 50 problems that have been produced today, that might seem like a great problem. Yeah.
I think that one, just maybe we're running a little bit out of time, but just maybe as a wrapping up a little bit, what you are raising up to me is one of the keys, and I think that Daniel was actually saying, right, like we're following the steps of engineers. That to me is a problem. I think architecture historically, and that my book is actually about that. It's about reclaiming a territory that I think is getting lost, because if we continue applying tools that have been developing outside the discipline, I think architecture is dead. It's goodbye, right? And I think that the only way for architects to survive as a discipline is to actually develop the systems of representation that affect the discipline. And I think that many are trying to do that. When I presented this problem back in the 2000s, people did not like it at all, because I was saying architects were not the authors. And I think that authorship usually is referred as the machine as the author. But what about the author that actually programs the machine, or the author that conceives the machine? So my theory is about rethinking architecture in terms of developing media in order to problematize media determinism. So I think that the question that you're saying, architecture and computation, what is the relationship? I think that that's what needs to be resolved today. Otherwise, we're going to disappear. And I think it's very clear what's happening today with the systems that are displacing architects. And the only way to reclaim that territory is to develop one that can compete. The problem is the digital feudalism. The problem is that architects alone, we are never going to be able to get enough funding as Elon Musk is able to do through the lies of Elon Musk, right? The idea of capitalism as a monopoly, money funding engine. And I think that grants are a problem, because we are all writing grants independently, and it's not collaborative. That was one of the objectives of the symposium, to rethink collaboration, because if we don't get all together, we're going to disappear. If we do not build up something that can compete, capitalism, I mean, I'm very critical of capitalism. I'm a New Yorker, an American citizen, but I think that if we continue with capitalism, the world is going to be extinguished, and we're all going to be dead. So I think that the problem is, how do we compete with a monopoly such as Musk or OpenAI, right? OpenAI is the monopoly now, right? They control everything, even the data that we produce. It's like crazy, right? So we cannot compete by creating one system, because we don't have enough power. So the idea of collective automation to me is to do what the system, some of the systems that we are all using, Reddit and platforms and so on, in which we could build up a power that could be equally as powerful as the digital feudalism that is imposing onto us. That's to me the issue today.
All right. Perhaps because we're running out of time, unless someone has any last.
Nelson wants to say
okay,
something.
Okay, yes, please. Nelson, make it like the closing statement, or the closing
Thank you.
question.
But no pressure.
Hi,
no
Athena.
pressure.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you guys, and thank you for the presentations. They were actually quite remarkable, and so I want to congratulate everybody on that. I just want to kind of ask a question, because I always have this sort of conundrum every time I'm talking about technology in general, but specifically about like artificial intelligence or like deep learning, which is what it really is. Are we? Because I think the problem here is knowledge versus just application of some knowledge produced by somebody else, which is not the same thing. You know, when you're implementing, Pablo brought this up, when you're implementing a graph, you don't really have to understand it. You just need to have it from the mathematician who does. Okay, so are we doing just engineering when we are applying things, or are we actually using knowledge and producing knowledge? For me, if whatever it is I'm using, be it ChatGPT or whatever it is, if I don't learn anything, it doesn't interest me. Like, I'm not interested. If it's just like to get results, it's like the discussion between physicists, you know, quantum physics, like the shut up and calculate approach and the realist approach, which is if you can't understand it, you're not really doing it. It's doing you. So for me, I just want to kind of leave that out there to see what you think. Like, what do you think about that? Like, can we define engineering as just tinkering and getting results, even if you don't understand? And science and knowledge, when you understand, even if it doesn't work. Thank you.
Maybe I'll quickly jump in to just say that I mean, again, historically, this has been such a present debate in the AI community, the scientists versus the engineers. And yeah, so and actually there's been like really interesting kind of ethnographic studies looking at that in specific settings, but also just historically, like it's actually been explicitly stated as a kind of debate. And I think it's exciting to actually talk about it, because I think for a long time it wasn't being talked about. And even today, I mean, I completely agree with you. I also get very bored. Like I love, you know, I use Midjourney a little bit, and then I'm kind of like bored, right? Which, you know, I hate to say publicly, because I think that there is also, it might be my own, I understand though that this is my own kind of biases and way of thinking about computing as kind of, yes, having a sort of about being about knowledge, less though than it is about kind of results and engineering. And to me, I think like maybe where I would maybe kind of leave the conversation is that it's important to acknowledge that as a debate between just competing cultures around what computing is and what its role in kind of society is. Because I think there's a very strong sort of idea that computing is a kind of humanist enterprise, that it really amplifies, you know, systematizes knowledge, it produces kind of new plateaus of understanding versus it produces results. And thinking about graphs specifically, I think what's interesting, an interesting part of the story, because Daniel spoke about architects as kind of moths going towards the flame. I kind of in the histories that I've been looking at, it's been much more about them having a sort of parasitic, you know, that you absorb public money because you actually want to really figure something out. You learned that math in high school and want to understand how it could be kind of applied to architecture. And so I think there's also kind of space for thinking about, also to Pablo's earlier points about kind of architectural agency. Yeah, I don't think it's just kind of absorbing techniques. I think there's always been a kind of intense imagination in kind of positioning, like again, to Alex's point about fictions, like even the projects that you showed, Alex, which are quite applied and can have very exciting real world applications, they do have this kind of incredibly evocative component, and they are kind of like fictions for living, you know? So I think like architecture has consistently been putting kind of computing and computational systems in the realm of culture. And I think that's kind of an exciting, thing to do. But maybe other people have thoughts,
Yeah. I mean, a lot of things have been said. About my own work, for example, I know I am fully aware that this is a very straightforward, every project has a very straightforward, measurable conclusion, exactly because I need to be in a position, anybody that is working on the project, we need to be in a position to tell somebody that makes a decision this is how much it costs, and this is how much it does, and this is how it will affect your life. To arrive to the position where you can actually say this, in my opinion, it means, like the way I'm handling it psychologically, let's say, is that I do not care so much if I'm doing architecture or if I'm doing engineering or if I'm a calculator. I prioritize the project. And because this is not a single person, this is a team, and somebody puts an idea, and somebody puts a technical thing, and somebody else puts another idea, and there is a network. It's never a single author. It's always a group. Like with all the projects you saw have 2 or 3 professors involved, 2 or 3 PhD students involved from different fields, and so on. What is I think that what we have unique, because we come from architecture, is the ability to maintain excitement in this team, to keep working on the thing, to be able to pull it, step outside of it, or pull it together when it's coming, when it's becoming a little bit loose and it's losing its its tightness. I don't have I personally don't have I don't need to prove that I am an architect and therefore you should listen to me. I have an anxiety whether the project I'm doing is useful. It is real. I have this, recently I have developed this kind of thing. And the world kind of works like that in a way. Funding, grants, and so on. Engineers, what do? They measure something, and because they give a result that is better than the previous result, they are able to access $1 million of grant for the next 2 years to work on something. So we should be able, through our imagination, through our competence, through our social cultural awareness of technology, we should be able to arrive at better numbers. That's how I see it. We should be able to arrive at better numbers, and what numbers are those are up to us. Any design project is a hypothesis for me. Is this real? That's how the hypothesis is articulated. Whatever I have in front of me, whatever representation, whatever thing, is this real? That's my anxiety. Is it real? Is it a possible thing? Is it going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you on that. I used to have the anxiety of architecture discipline, like where am I doing architecture? What is the discipline now? I used to study a lot, and we had Eisenman, actually, Peter Eisenman recently, the school, like Eisenman's work about architecture and autonomy and the discipline. And actually when I went to MIT, I like all this kind of like was taken, this like perception was taken. I was and then I got like a period of anxiety, like, am I doing architecture? I'm not doing architecture. And then I got over it. And like I was thinking, like, do we need to have this? I mean, especially when I step out of practice, right? Because architecture is a practice, but when we step out of it and do research, and research is inherently like interdisciplinary, and like Daniel touched on that, like, do we still need to have this kind of stress about proving the autonomy of the discipline? And I don't know, like maybe, yeah, it's a question. I know that Pablo has a different.
No, but I don't misunderstand what I say about discipline. I didn't mean discipline in that sense, because the problem is, for instance, a mathematician, you cannot do interdisciplinarity if you don't know the math. I mean, we cannot play to think that we are going to do math better than a mathematician. And that's when the interdisciplinary discourse fails, because we cannot pretend that we're going to replace a scientist, because you need to dedicate your entire life to know very little about reality. And that's when I think that the interdisciplinary discourse, you have to be careful, because if you don't provide something to the table in the interdisciplinary discourse, I come from Bateson, right? Like Gregory Bateson invented the word interdisciplinarity. I understand it in a very different way. I think that there is a confusion today in terms of disciplines talking to each other, versus playing to be interdisciplinary. I think that there is a confusion because that's not what Bateson meant. Bateson meant that experts bring to the table a problem from different points of view, and there is something to resolve. That's a problem-based learning, right? And I think that when we play outside the boundary of knowledge, we are translating knowledge, and I think that that's one of the issues today. So for instance, I give you an example. In machine learning is full of translation, and there are different data formats that are problematically transferring to ridiculous numbers. And if you lose track of the math, you're translating something that doesn't make any sense. And you're going to validate the output because it's what Nelson says, right? If you're not aware of the process and you're just applying a technology or applying a science, you are going to fall into the trap that you are going to think that you're in control of the problem, where in reality the problem controls you. And I think that in terms of media, that becomes an issue. And I think that that's what Alex is. I think that Alex, I agree with the disciplinary, or whatever you want to call it. To me, it's transdisciplinary more the perhaps the word.
I call it
what Alex is doing with
discipline.
energy. Huh?
I call it a-disciplinary, without a discipline.
Okay.
It's in the background. It's a soup. All disciplines are a soup around us, and we just grab a part of it and we do something with it. Then we throw it back into the soup. Then we grab something else. We do something with it. We throw it back into the soup. That's how I see it. And everybody contributes equally to this. I mean, the anxiety we have is like, what is the specific thing that we are putting into the mix from because of our education and because of the way we are. I think this is a challenge, but because we are designers, I think we can have a very easy life in this new world, because mathematics and science and all of these things have been employed sometimes in a good way. Sometimes they lead to things like the climate crisis and the inequity and so on. It's the same mathematics that do all of these kinds of things. So it's the way you apply them and the way you put them in the world is something I think we have an expertise in.
But maybe the difference is between architecture and design, because the issue to me today is that I feel that especially in the division between Techne and Archi, right? The problem is the design. That I don't think that in design you can do politics. Like, in other words, the politics of the system or the structure, when you do design, is not there. And I think that the architect, as a contractor or as a constructor, or the architect of the mathematics, right, is a little bit more aware of the politics of the structure that are working through. That's why, and that's what I see in your work, by the way. I see that you're working with the network structure of the energy, and that's your politics. You cannot just design as a designer. You are designing the structure of the system, and that's what I perhaps disagree on.
We don't understand. We don't see the design in the same. We don't use the word in the same way.
Exactly.
We see design as a process of putting together society and technology in a very basic way. Design also involves aesthetics, and aesthetics is politics.
Yeah, absolutely. In that sense, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
Just probably want to add that. Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, the quick.
No, it's all right. It's all right.
No, go ahead. Now I'm
don't
curious. I want to listen to it.
No, because just the whole discussions, it went on at the end, like a semantics discussion in a sense. So, no, I just want to add that my definition of, I left architecture as a discipline a long time ago. For me, it's an organizational principle that you can find it everywhere, actually. So just to leave it there. So it's not important. It's just like my personal.
No, it is important. I think, because it gives validation to us that studied architecture, that
There's no big deal. At the end, it's no big deal. We're all doing it.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I think we are like half an hour over, so maybe we should.
No, it's fine. 8:30 is actually very good timing. We used to do longer, so Thank
Yeah.
you, everybody.
Yeah, we had a wonderful discussion. Thank you all so much. And the presentations were like, all of them intriguing and
everybody kept to the 20 minutes. So we appreciate the concise presentations. They were all very clear. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope to have more opportunities to continue those discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I think it's a much longer discussion. It would be great to find more opportunities. Yeah.
Exactly. Let's find more opportunities to meet.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.